Hey Nathan, so here's a little demo on that background. I've done a rough underpainting using white and a navy blue to get some of the shades. Whenever we're painting something that has the sense of having glowing lights, we want those areas to be as bright as possible. So in those, glowing light sections, I've got pretty pure white down on the page. I'm going to mix a few colors here, pull out and kind of set up my palette. I'm looking at pinks, some bright blues. I'm using an ultramarine and kind of a brighter sky blue, cobalt blue. And then I've got a magenta, a violet, and some greens and a little bit of yellow. I also have a good solid amount of blending medium in the center here that you'll see me pulling out of. You can also use water, but it will take a little longer and you'll have to dry more in between layers. If I leave it with the blending medium, I give myself a little bit more time. So to create these sort of quick shades, the first layer we're going to do is just sort of color blocking. So each place that you want the pinks, you're going to put the pinks in and we can kind of wash over it. Even extending into the backgrounds, we don't have to be very clean about it. You can just kind of tint right over it. It adds depth to your underpainting and also kind of helps show that glowing soft edge effect if we just sort of paint right over the underpainting. Works particularly well since your background is mostly dark. If this were like lighter areas around it, it would be a little bit more, it would show up more. But since your background is essentially, black coming forward into light, this works really well. So we're going to do this section that has the blue lights, some bounced light on some of the other dark areas. This blue has, because it looks lighter on the page, you can tell it has a little bit of white in it. So it's a little more opaque, it covers more. But I'm still using blending medium in it, but it's going to be more opaque than our pure pigments like the darker blues or the purples. So I think I'm digging for my favorite yellow right now. There we go. Because I want just a little bit. There's just a few areas in this that I see kind of a yellow tint with a little bit of orange in it. I'm making it a little bit muddy so that when I paint those in, yellow being not very opaque to begin with, I'm not using very much medium with it, but those areas are going to seem really bright right now. We'll tone them later, but at least we've got the right kind of colors in the right places. Now you can see how even though this pink would seem like it would be brighter, when it goes over that dark navy background, it actually does help increase its depth of field. It feels darker, more saturated, but also tints it so it's a little bit warmer. It's showing some of that reflected bounce light. I'm mixing a darker blue now to help me put in some of the kind of shadow areas and to do some tinting, but it has quite a bit of medium in it and a little tiny bit of green in it for those like grayer areas and where we're seeing some odd reflections. This is like a deep maroon. It's kind of how I'm going to step between the deep dark purples and the pinks of this world. So I'm using it over areas that are already dark because it's going to show up a little bit more, and it has a nice quality on top of the navies to kind of like warm those areas up to show that pink light. There's still blending medium in it, but not a bunch, just a little bit. So I'm kind of bouncing around. I'm working on different sections while different things dry, kind of buying some time here. And especially because inside of light sources, things like that, there's usually 2 or 3 colors. There's like a brighter color, there's going to be a shadow color still. Even though there's a light there, it's still how we create the sense of a glow, how we create the feeling of there being a source, but also like the can around the source or the container of the source. Usually there's like a piece of glass or something in front of it that changes how the reflections come through. So I'm getting more specific about where some of those shadows are, especially in the blue sources right now. Instead of painting over the whole thing, I'm picking a few areas in the light that I'm seeing a little more saturation, a little more true color. Now I have white with some gel medium in it, and we're going to go to our brightest areas and pick out the highlights and the shapes of those. So in your research image, it looks like the brightest areas are mostly these blue lights stacked across the top and bottom of the window. This, I can't quite tell what it is. It looks like a sign maybe, like a neon sign that's sort of along the edge of the window. And I'm not filling the whole area, so I'm taking the white and kind of creating a highlight inside the painting. What's underneath is still wet. So when I draw this like thin line of white in some areas along that neon sign that's vertical next to the window, it creates a glowing effect because around it is blue and then a step darker blue, and then eventually it gets into the background. But it's all kind of soft and painterly around the edges. We're not worried about clean edges. I did go ahead and add some brightness, some white to the pink angled lights, and I'm gonna now use, even though that's not entirely dry, I'm gonna mix on top of it with my pink to tone those. But you can see they look so much brighter with a little bit of white in them, but we don't want them to feel as bright as the blue lights, which are definitely a little hotter in your research image. And then these windows up here are like they don't feel like a direct source of light. They just feel like maybe there's some lights inside these windows or something else glowing behind them. So they're value-wise darker, but hue very similar. So we're using the same pink and layering over it, but because we underpainted some dark things underneath and we haven't added white, they're going to feel darker. I'm also taking a little bit of blue and buffing it in for some shadows and to help deepen that value to make sure these don't get as bright as the other pink lights. So you can see how much your underpainting really is supporting you. It's giving you your architecture, it's giving you, grounding and anchoring, and it's already built your values in for you. So if you have a really, really well completed underpainting, it's going to be easier to do these kind of glazes over it. All you're having to focus on is like the brightness of the hue. So I'm going through with blue now and adding another layer of like shadows to the blue lights. There's kind of a blue shadow at the bottom of each of the pink lights. Since I'm working with transparent medium, I have to kind of go over things a few times sometimes to help make sure I get it as dark as I want, but it's a nice controlled painterly way of like working up to it. A few bounced areas of yellow light here. And now we're going to start tweaking our values overall. So I want this window to feel much darker across the board without losing any of our detailing. So I'm kind of feathering in some shadows. I'm using the navy blue since that was my like darkest color, but it's got a pretty, if you build it up, it can go almost entirely black. And the coolness of it helps it recede. Like a Mars black would also work nicely because it would have that cool tone in it. I might mix just a touch of blue into it just to help keep it from feeling flat. Store-bought black can sometimes feel just too flat. Less like a choice. So I'm taking that same navy blue and picking out a few areas throughout that could just start to go darker that help me keep the architecture and enforce the overall shape and value of the piece. You kind of want to step back once in a while and make sure that everything in relation to each other is making sense. The darker the background goes, the darker we sink those highlights, the brighter the white, or the darker we sink the shadows, the brighter the white glowing highlights feel in the light. So if everything else in the world is dark, then those feel super bright and like direct source light. If we don't make everything else darker, then they don't feel as bright by comparison, and then it changes the mood of the piece overall. So here I'm using the navy with a bit of a glaze on it to start pushing things back, pulling things forward. This is like a very sculptural part of the painting. This is why when we talk about doing, your contrast is one of your last steps. This is where we make sure everything makes sense. Everything can't have the same level of contrast when we're dealing with a composition of a room or a space or something like that. Some things need to be midtones. Some things need to be, secondary, almost dark, but not quite as dark as the darkest shadow. And especially when dealing with lighting, it becomes important to help sell that feeling of brightness, of glowing, So I went ahead and let that dry, and now I've got my brush with some of the blue navy on it, and I'm just finishing up, touching over a really thin wash with some water of picking out some areas and sending them backwards in space and toning some colors. So a wash of the navy over those yellows helps to tone those down. The best way to create those soft glows, though, is just to be a little bit messy when you're painting over your underpainting. I mean, just don't paint inside the lines. Let it kind of tumble outside the line a little bit, let it expand beyond it, because it has dark beyond it, not light colors. It's going to just be like a soft glow around the outside of the lighting. Using a little bit of pink to tone over some of the areas I just painted my darkest shadows into, so they still feel like they have some texture. Adding another round of midtones and shadows into my blue lights so that I can add that final touch of bright white, but I want the temperature of the lights to be a little more obvious. And then finding some of the areas where they drip or the light hits something else or bounces off. Toning some shadows in a few of the lights with this now like cobalt blue. So we've gone from, we had a white with a little bit of blue, then we did kind of a sky blue. Now I'm doing a little bit of a transparent cobalt blue, working it into these windows up here so they feel like they have depth behind them but still have that pink glow. And then they have like a specific highlight that shows that there's a glass in front of it. Since all of it's wet, it's blending on the page. Just keep your brush moving in the direction that you want everything to flow. In that case, I was using sort of curved and upward. Now these final touches of bright white highlights while things are still wet are going to really help force the high contrast to make those seem like they're glowing. Remember that your white also has a cooling effect, so if you're going for something with a lot of heat and you use white on top of it, it's going to start feeling kind of cooled down. But since we're working with all cool tone colors in this, that kind of comes into play a little bit less. Forcing some areas back, toning them in so that the textures are there. Those thin washes on top just help them mask the brightness, and we'll call it done. I hope that helps, and good luck.